Okay, so I see a lot of familiar faces, but I'm Dave, and you should be going to hell, but I'm not going, and that's pretty cool. So I'm happy about that. Am I in the wrong spot, Willie? Don't go further. I can't go. Do not pass the fern. The stool. All right, so I have boundaries. This is going to be difficult. I'm not good with boundaries. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what the course is about. First of all, as we put in the bulletin, this is essentially a repeat information-wise of 5 years ago when we did the resurrection course. And the logic behind that was threefold. First, since that time, there have been a number of new faces in the church that weren't there for that. Other people were in another class and didn't take it. And then there's always people that like to hear things a couple of times. So because of that, those three things, we decided to do it again. So this is not, in terms of information, particularly new compared to 2011. But if you weren't there for the first time, or you just like to hear it the second time, then either way, that's perfectly fine. But just so you know that going in, okay? Christianity, unlike other worldviews and philosophies, or many other worldviews and philosophies, rests itself upon historical claims. Christianity is only valid if certain things actually happened. So when you read the Bible makes all kinds of claims about the past. It says God created, it says the Israelites were in Egypt, it says the Red Sea parted, right? It says God made himself into a human person, came down on earth, suffered on a cross, died, and came back. So if those things aren't true, particularly the last one, then this all is an enormous waste of time. So in order for us to build an apologetic, right, that is going to function in the world, we have to be able to defend the historicity of the resurrection. Now, I don't claim in any way that any of this apologetic stuff that we do here is going to save anyone. God does the saving. And I've come to really understand that as time goes on. You can't talk somebody into heaven with a bunch of facts. However, it is also true that in the world that we find ourselves, there are many, many people that have various stumbling blocks that are preventing them from turning their heart to God. Among those stumbling blocks are factual stumbling blocks. And among those are stumbling blocks that have to do with the historicity of the resurrection. People going, that couldn't have happened. People don't come back from the dead. This guy did not get out of the tomb. Okay? And so for us, I think it's helpful both to edify our own faith and also to go out in the world and be armed with and equipped with information for those we meet to have this as a backdrop for our own understanding of the resurrection. So the way this course breaks down is, and by the way, that's why I called it in time and space. We have to be able to understand the resurrection as something that really, really actually physically happened, right, in a real time, in a real place, in a real tomb, right, with real people who really saw the real Jesus bodily coming back and hanging out for 40 days cooking fish, all right, that really happened. And as we understand it as really happening, I think that strengthens us as we talk to an unbelieving world. So this course breaks down in basically 4 areas. There's really 4 ways if you're going to construct an apologetic to defend the resurrection historically. The first way is extra-biblical evidence. Now that breaks down into a couple different areas. One is documentary evidence, which itself also breaks down into a couple different areas, which is people that kind of like Jesus and Christians, and people that really don't, okay? And then also archaeological evidence, okay? So there's stuff you dig out of the ground that supports biblical texts, and then there's other people writing other stuff that supports biblical texts. And both of those can be reasonably helpful. Not the fern, not the stool. Right, got it. Boundaries. I'm going to have to put tape down. I'm going to have to put, that's the boundary over here. Fern to fern. Not quite fern to fern. The second thing is you've got to establish the New Testament as historically reliable. Because, again, unlike other philosophies and worldviews, or many other philosophies and worldviews, the New Testament is deeply rooted in history. It says people went certain places, right? It says they encountered certain people. It said they did certain things, right? I mean, the New Testament makes all kind of historical claims, all right? It says, Jesus went here. Jesus healed this person. This guy came out, was raised from the dead. It makes all kinds of historical claims. It makes claims about the early church, right? It says they shared their possessions in common. It says that they faced persecution. It says lots of things. These things are historically investigatable to a certain extent. Okay? So, to the extent which you can establish the texts themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts in particular, as historically reliable, that's very helpful. The third thing is you have to look at evidence from the inside. And what that means is the New Testament has to cohere as a whole. That is, our critics that are out there love to try to find ways to make the Gospels not sync with each other. That the information in one is not quite what is the information in another, right? They say Jesus healed 2 demon-possessed guys, or Jesus healed 1 demon-possessed guy. They try to find contradictions. Okay? There has to be both an internal sense within the documents, and then they have to sync up with each other. Okay? This also speaks to historical reliability. And then you have to look at resurrection and say, well, if it's not resurrection, what else could it be? And then you have to look at alternative propositions to resurrection, and you have to strike them down. And by the way, there are about 7 of those, all of which can be struck down. Okay? So it's quite a project. All right? For us, we're kind of going to follow this order roughly, but as you can see, these areas do overlap with each other. Okay? They're not all distinctly separate. So we try to weave that together as we go. Okay? Okay, so who's Dave ripping off this time? Well, because remember, Dave, there's nothing Dave does that's original, almost nothing. Okay, except for the sarcastic humor. That's mine. Okay. Josh McDowell's my biggest ripoff, okay? If there's a Michael Jordan of this field, it's Josh McDowell, okay? F.F. Bruce, J.P. Moreland, Gary Habermas is really good. And then there's a whole bunch of others too, okay? Towards the end of the course, we're going to take a deep look at the resurrection events and the characters involved, because we don't always consider all the characters. By all the characters, I mean there's 20 some odd people that are really central to that story. Okay? And we're going to look at where they were exactly and how the story makes sense with the geography of Jerusalem, right? And a whole lot of other things. So we're going to kind of go down deep on this if we can. And we can. Okay? All right, first key ground rule. Not all questions are currently answerable. This is very important, particularly to me, because when we do these courses, I tend to get asked a lot of questions afterwards or at other times, which is great. The problem is not all questions are currently answerable. And the worst thing for me, or for us in general, would be if someone were to come to the conclusion that because it wasn't answerable, that sort of invalidates the rest of it. But that's kind of silly. We don't approach the rest of life like that, so it wouldn't really be fair to approach this like that. And of course, the second question, not all questions that are currently answerable are answerable by Dave. So the worst pressure I feel is someone coming up asking me something, I go, I don't know, and they go, well, then the heck with that resurrection stuff, I guess. Well, that's not really fair either, okay? So we as a whole, like as a world, don't know everything, right? And certainly of that, stuff that there is to know, I certainly don't know, much of that. So it's illogical to conclude that if we can't answer it, or I can't answer it, or it's not answerable, that therefore it never will be answerable, or somehow that invalidates the whole thing. Okay? All right, so let's dive right in. We're going to start with what we call extra-biblical evidences. And the key with any evidence historically is to sort of make the right amount of it. In other words, you don't want to make too much of it, but you want to validate what you can make of it. Okay? You don't want to stretch it too far, and assert that it now means something that it doesn't mean, right? So in terms of extra biblical evidence, when we say what's it good for, one thing it is good for is it can corroborate historical information in New Testament books. All right, so I'll give you an example. If it says that the early church shared their goods in common, right, as it says in the book of Acts, right, and you find information in somebody else's writings that suggests that that's what they were doing, then that's good outside corroboration, okay? If it says Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, right, and you find that attestation in some other extra-biblical text, that's good corroboration of that as a historical event, okay? And so they can be very helpful that way. They can corroborate, as we said, the details. They can corroborate who wrote them. So many times in some of these early sources, in the early 2nd century or even the late 1st century, we find people saying who wrote the New Testament books, which is a very big issue. Why is that a very big issue, who wrote the New Testament books? Why does it matter if John wrote John or Matthew wrote Matthew? Well, because Matthew and John hung out with who? Jesus. So that's kind of a big deal. And by the way, that's a huge deal, especially in a world today where we keep seeing all these, Discovery Channel whatevers where they say, the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of Mary, or all these other Gospels that somehow were unfairly kept out of the Bible, and they neglect to tell you, well, they were written in the 3rd century by somebody who, by the way, wasn't Judas, and wasn't Mary, and wasn't Peter, and all these other fake names that are on them. But if I know that this thing was written by John, who hung out with Jesus, who, by the way, was Jesus' little cousin, that's kind of better. So they can help corroborate not only what's in the text, they can corroborate who wrote the text, and that matters because of their position in relation to Jesus himself. You see, the Gospels aren't just saying Jesus came out of the tomb. The Gospels, if they're written by who we say they are written by guys who then were there and then were eating fish with him on a beach. That's a different kind of claim, right, than somebody writing something, 200 years later. Matters, okay? They can also assist in dating New Testament books. They say, well, how do they do that? Well, they can do that in a number of ways. One, they can just say it directly. Occasionally they do. They'll say, well, Mark wrote it around this time. Okay? Or they can just be quoting from New Testament books. If I have a source in 95 AD that quotes from New Testament books, that means that book was written before when? 95 AD. Which makes it terribly inconvenient for people that want to claim that those books were written what? Later. You can't quote from it if it ain't there. Okay? So that's very helpful. Now, why would that be so critical? Because of the nature of the claims that are inside these books. These books claim some very specific things. By the way, they claim people got raised from the dead. They claim that people got healed. If these things are written in the 60s and 70s, that's 30 years after the event in question. Lazarus is still walking around. Okay? People that got healed are still walking around. In fact, if you look very carefully at the New Testament, it says basically, you can check it out. By the way, that's a dangerous game to play if you actually can't what? Check it out. So when these things were written, by whom they were written is a huge deal. Okay? And outside sources can help us with that project, with corroboration. Okay, they can also dispel notions that we have in our current culture about, which are somehow popularized through either the media or pop culture, that certain doctrines came into place later. I'll give you the best example, which I think you guys probably all know. A few years ago, there was a movie came out. Do you know what movie I'm talking about? Not Tom Cruise. Who's the guy? Tom Hanks. Why am I drawing a blank on the movie now? Thank you. Jeez. Wow. Yeah, there were two. There's Angels and Demons and there's Da Vinci Code, right? Da Vinci Code is based on a book by Dan Brown, right? Dan Brown's book is presented as what? Historical fiction. Now, historical fiction is supposed to be fiction that's based on what? History. So if you write a World War II novel, right? All right, Hitler's got to be in charge of Germany, or it's not really historical fiction anymore. It's just fiction. Yeah? Okay, so the most dangerous thing you can do is write a book called historical fiction, which is completely what? Fiction, and then claim that the historical backdrop is actually real. So among the many things Dan Brown claims in the book, right, are that the idea that Jesus was God or that Jesus was worshipped came about in the early 4th century. That's one of the claims. And this claim became very popular, right? This is popularized that, this notion that, Christ was God, right, sort of popped into existence centuries later. So if we then have early documentation, let's say from the Romans, talking about these annoying Christians who keep worshiping Christ as God, and these documents are in the early 2nd or in the 1st century, what does that do to that particular claim? Blows it right out of the water. You see? You see, opinions are nice. Everyone has a right to his or her opinion, but people do not have a right to their own what? Facts. Facts are troublesome things. All right? And so if I have guys in the early 2nd or late 1st century saying, these annoying Christians, they keep worshiping that Jesus guy as God, Dan Brown's claim about that happening in the early 4th century is gone. It's gone. Okay. And they can corroborate the text of the New Testament. I think you guys get the idea. Okay, so why does it matter to look outside the Bible? See, most of us in this room, probably all of us in this room, have come to a place where we accept the Bible as reliable. That's because of our own experience in our own lives, or maybe other reasons as well. But many of us, most of us, if not all of us, accept the Bible as historically reliable. We're in a world where that's not the case. We're actually in a world where people don't necessarily understand that the Bible is a historical text, or filled with many texts that are historical, I should say. Okay? Much of the Bible makes historical claims. Many people who don't read the Bible regularly see the Bible as a bunch of either stories or fairy tales or parables or words of wisdom or something like that. But they don't really haven't really delved in and understood the nature of what's claimed there. Okay? So if we have outside evidence that suggests that these claims are true, that is helpful for those who don't already accept that the text of the Bible is true. Okay? The other thing that's kind of cool is a lot of the sources that we get early on are sources that are what we call hostile sources. And hostile sources, in one way, are better than friendly sources. Why do you think hostile sources are better than friendly sources? Because if a guy that doesn't like you and can't stand you and thinks the Christians are a bunch of pests, right? Or was even involved in persecuting them, if they're attesting to certain factual information, their bias is actually swung the entire other way. So if they say it's so, guess what? It must be so, because their inclination, right, is to go the other way. So in some ways, what we call the principle of hostile attestation, right, when somebody who doesn't like you is attesting to what you're saying, that's really cool. We get quite a bit of that. So who are these people in the extra-biblical text? There's the early Christians. Those are our friendly sources, right? Then there's Roman and Greek commentators. Most of them are our hostile sources. There's Jewish commentators. Again, most are hostile sources, okay? Now, one of the questions that comes up is, when we look at extra-biblical texts, why don't we get more Jesus in them? In other words, if he's this incredibly central figure, right, world-changing figure, just in a history way, forget the fact that we think he's God, right, but just in terms of what happens because of him, then why wouldn't these early sources dwell on him more? Well, you have to understand a little bit about what history was in the 1st century, in the 2nd century. For the most part, people who are doing history are writing about politics and war. They are not writing about social movements led by Jewish carpenters. Okay? So from a Roman perspective, this guy's kind of a weird annoyance, right? From a Jewish perspective, he's another what? False Messiah. But the bottom line is, there's not a lot written about a lot in this time, other than what? Big stuff like what? Politics and war. So in actuality, given the time period we're talking about, there's actually an awful lot of Jesus in terms of these extra biblical sources. Okay? In terms of who he is in the culture, what you would expect. So given that this is not normally what's written about, right? Which is basically what? A dispute among Jews about who the Messiah is. Really, that's what it is, right? You see an awful lot about Jesus in the texts. Okay? So, we do get references about him. They're not overwhelming. We can't make too much of the amount. But then again, it's not underwhelming either. Okay? The Roman authors aren't concerned with that kind of thing. And the Jewish authors are inclined to be somewhat dismissive. Because after all, in their mind, he's a false Messiah, and they don't want to give him any street cred, basically. Okay? But even in those passing references that they make, there's actually quite a bit you can make of it. Okay? Whether they intended that or not, you still can. Okay? Okay. We get this idea, I think. Got it. Okay. So let's start looking at the friendly sources first. And again, in some ways, the friendly sources are very helpful, right? And the hostile sources in some ways are even more helpful. Okay, this guy here who is Papias, he's a bishop, okay? His writings are preserved by Eusebius, who actually preserves some other ancient writings. So sometimes it'll be so-and-so as preserved in Eusebius, okay? But it's attributed to Papias. So he's writing in the early 2nd century, and he insists that Mark was the accurate transcriber of Peter. Okay, now we generally regard historically, right, as Mark's gospel as really Mark being Peter's buddy, and Mark being sort of, that the gospel of Mark is sort of seen through the lens of Peter. Okay? Which is really interesting, because how's Peter come off in the gospel of Mark? Not too good, right? He's the denier, right? He wimps out, right? By the way, that's also important too when we get to that. If you're going to write a gospel and you're going to fake stuff, are you going to make yourself look terrible? But these guys wrote a bunch of gospels that make them look dumb, cowardly, thick as a brick, right? The only way you write a gospel like that is if it's what? True. If you're going to fake it, make yourself look good. They don't do that. Okay? He says Mark was careful not to omit anything that he had heard, not to include any false statement among them. He also claims that Matthew also is a writer of the gospel events. Okay? So that's good from the perspective of somebody early 2nd century claiming that Matthew and Mark are 1st century authors who are writing down the gospels that bear their names. That's important because remember, it's important who wrote it. It's important what? When they wrote it. And then the stuff inside corroborating that is also important. Okay? But the who and the when is important. Irenaeus, who comes a little later, he's another bishop. He is a student of Polycarp, and who was martyred in AD 156. Polycarp dovetails in, because John lives the longest, and I think Polycarp is really young when he knows John, okay? But he's a disciple of John. So we've got John, Jesus' disciple and cousin, right, who's the author of the Gospel of John. Polycarp as a youngster, right, with John, and then, Polycarp, and then Irenaeus is his student. Well, Irenaeus says, so firm is the ground upon which these Gospels rest, that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them, and starting from these documents, each one of them endeavors to establish his own particular doctrine. In other words, the heresies that he's noticing, right, are spinning off of what? The Gospels. In other words, he says the people that are making up their own thing all have to start by trying to attack what? The Gospels, because they are so firmly established. So by the way, if people ever say something like, well, those Gospels that, the Bible wasn't really in use, or the Gospels really weren't circulating, or, what was in the Bible was, up in the air, and some of these Gospels should have made it in and they didn't. That's not true. We've got firm ground not only for the 2nd century, but for the 1st century of that the Gospels were in use and being quoted. Okay? That's a fairly late date, actually, compared to what we have. Okay? He also affirms that Matthew wrote his Gospel. And he says, when Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there. Well, that's pretty early. Okay? That's pretty early. He pushed that back. He's pushed that back into the middle of the 1st century. That's very important again, because that's within a generation or so of the event in question. And that's critical because, again, the claims that are made, some of them are verifiable in that time period, right? Again, if you have people who have been healed, right, some of them could still be what? Alive 30 years later, okay? And that Mark wrote after their death. So he actually has Matthew first, Mark second, right? In modern scholarship, there's a bit of a, contention about is Matthew first or is Mark first. You'll have people going either way. He says Matthew is first, okay? And he also talks about Mark recording the substance of Peter's testimony. Thus again connecting Mark to whom? Peter. And Peter, right, is directly connected to Jesus. Okay? So again, we're getting Peter's story through Mark, basically. Okay? And Luke for Paul. Okay? And then as we think about it today in modern scholarship, John producing his gospel later on in Ephesus. Okay? 95 AD is the what century? That's the 1st century, okay? Clement of Rome is quoting Scripture in 95 AD. What does that tell you about the Scriptures he's quoting? They're already written, which means anyone that wants to push any of the Gospels into the 2nd century, you can't do it, because Clement is already quoting them before the 1st century closes. Ignatius, also an early guy. He is a martyr. He's also a disciple of John, Peter, and Paul. He affirms Jesus as being of the race of David and the son of Mary. And that he was human, was crucified under Pilate and Herod. He also affirms the resurrection, the virgin birth, and the baptism. So these are all events that we find in the Gospels, right, that he is now talking about outside of the Gospels. And he's doing it early on. And this is critical because, again, you're going to find people out there in the culture, and even fewer now in modern scholarship, but for a while it was quite popular to suggest that any, some, or all of these ideas, right, had come along much later. But you can't argue that when you have people attesting them outside the Bible, right, who are attesting to them very early on. Okay? Sorry, Dan Brown. Here's Eusebius preserving somebody else again. Remember we said he does that from time to time? Quadratus, early 2nd century. He is also a disciple of the apostles. He's bishop of the Church of Athens. He also affirms Jesus' miracles, raising people from the dead, healing people. Okay? And then he talks about, obviously, his younger lifetime, right? And says, while I was around, presumably as a young guy, right, some of these people that were healed or raised from the dead were still around. Okay? So try to get the lens that we're looking through here. He's not saying, yeah, I heard this, right? He's saying, I ran into people, presumably at the latter stages of their life, right, when I was a young guy, who got healed by Jesus. You understand that's a different perspective, right? So it matters intensely when these things are written because of the lens. And later on when we talk about resurrection, we talk about the disciples' view of the knowledge, right, where they're coming from, right? The disciples go out and die for something that's either true or false. But if it's false, they have every opportunity to know it's what? False. Why? Because they are proximate to the events in question. You see, it's one thing to say, I heard some guy came out of a tomb a long time ago. It's another thing to say, I stuck my head in the tomb and it was empty. You understand that? It's one thing to say, some guy died on a cross. It's another thing to say, I was at the foot of the cross and saw him suffer, John. Right? It's one thing to say, he came back, I heard. It's another thing to say, he cooked me breakfast on the beach. Okay, so the viewpoint from which these disciples, the when matters a lot. Okay? Okay, so he basically is saying, listen, we're not just claiming miracles here. The evidence, which is basically human evidence, right, for Jesus' miracles, is still around long after he goes back to heaven. You can check it out. Okay? Polycarp, we mentioned him before. He is also martyred. He is a disciple of John, who was a disciple of Jesus. He's the bishop of Smyrna. His writing is early 2nd century. He asserts Jesus' death on the cross, that Jesus was sinless, and that Christians, as he did, should be willing to suffer for Jesus' sake. Okay? This collection of writings is like a church manual, and it's also late 1st century. So not only do we have people quoting Scripture in the late 1st century, we've got a church manual surviving from the late 1st century, which itself quotes parts of Scripture, including the Sermon on the Mount, and basically references Gospels. Okay? So you've got a manual produced by the early church in the late 1st century, which is based on the Gospels. Okay, so those are very helpful, okay? All of those fit under the heading, however, of what we call friendly sources, people who like Jesus, people who are in the early church. By the way, I would say a lot of whom are, by the way, willing to die for their faith in Jesus. And by the way, that by itself doesn't tell you everything. Do people die for stuff that's not true? They do. People fly planes into, buildings and stuff because they believe something fervently. Just because you believe it fervently doesn't make it true, okay? But, as we'll see with the disciples, the vast majority of whom also die for their faith, right? There's a difference between dying for something that's a lie and dying for something that, if it is a lie, you have to know it's a lie because of the position in which you are to the events in question, okay? Okay. So, a few things. Not all of these early sources are using the Gospels. Some of them are, in fact, referencing the disciples' words. In other words, John told me, right? That kind of thing. So that's sort of second generation, if you will. The fact is, many of these people who are writing these sources are martyred in horrible ways. Okay? Which, by the way, again, is not by itself convincing, but it's something you have to take into account. You have to realize how much they did believe it. Okay? And sometimes they do neat things like appeal to stuff we don't have anymore. So they'll say things like, well, as it says in the Acts of Pilate. And you say, well, what the heck is the Acts of Pilate? And the answer is, we don't really know because it hasn't survived. Okay? However, it is interesting that they're referring to this document, which apparently was in existence, right, called what? The Acts of Pilate. Now, there's something completely outside what we know, right? And we would love to hold it and have it, but we don't. But what we have is these guys talking about it as if it's in existence, right? And by the way, that's a dangerous game to play, referring to the Acts of Pilate, if there's not a document called what? The Acts of Pilate, okay? So sometimes they add into our body of knowledge that way. Stuff that we wouldn't otherwise know because we don't have a copy of the Acts of Pilate, okay? Okay, so we have to be careful not to make too much of it because, again, for the most part, the friendly sources, not for the most part, they are on our side, okay? So we have to take that into account. On the other hand, this notion that they're disqualified because they're Christians, right, or because their bias leads one way is, I think, taking it too far, okay? But again, it's even better if you can find somebody that really doesn't like you, who really isn't down for the cause, who doesn't like Jesus, and they say the same things. So in fact, the hostile sources are actually better for us than the friendly sources. Okay? So, this guy's not a friendly source, right? Tacitus is an early historian, very well-known one, and he's considered to be very accurate. And again, see, that's another cool thing. If people are accurate in other areas that you can confirm, they get credibility, and then when they say something else, you have to take it seriously, if that makes sense. In other words, if Tacitus is accurate in other stuff, and then he says something about Christians, and he's been accurate in everything else that he said, and it's been corroborated to the extent that it can be corroborated, right? And then he says something about Christians, well, you probably should take that serious too, because the guy has a track record of being what? Right. By the way, I would say that about Luke. Luke, as we'll see later, gets fact-checked more than anybody. You want to know what his batting average is? It's 1,000. He never misses. So after a certain point, you go, hey, if Luke got all this right, all these little nitty-gritty details right, maybe he took the time to get the big stuff right too. Okay? But anyway, Tacitus asserts a bunch of things. Number one, he talks about the fire of Rome. You guys know the story of the fire of Rome, right? Rome goes up in flames, and there's this guy called Nero, who's the emperor at the time, who's mad as a hatter, right? Not a nice man, Nero. Okay? And he decides to deflect blame off himself. He's going to pin it on the people that nobody likes, and the people that nobody likes are us, right? So they're an easy target, right? A scapegoat, if you will. And he confirms that Nero did, in fact, scapegoat the Christians for that. He also confirms, though, that Christus, as he calls him, suffered the extreme penalty. Well, what's the extreme penalty in the Roman Empire? Crucifixion, you got it. Under the emperor who? Tiberius. Well, that is exactly right in terms of what the Gospels tell us, okay? At the hands of who? Pontius Pilate. By the way, do you know for a while people claimed Pontius Pilate didn't exist? That would be awkward for us, wouldn't it? But he did, and we find him in documents, and we find him in inscriptions. There is a Tiberius, there is a Pontius Pilate, there was crucifixion. They did use nails. Archaeology is a good thing for us. Every time someone digs in the ground and pulls something up relevant to what we're talking about, it checks out. Okay? And then, the most interesting part, a mischievous superstition following the extreme penalty broke out where? In Judea, Jerusalem, right? And spread to where? Rome. Well, mischievous superstition. Again, this is from a guy who doesn't get the Christians, right? Not a Christian. Calls it a mischievous superstition. What the heck could he be talking about? This mischievous superstition, in an era with no Twitter, no email, no Instagram, none of that stuff, went from Judea all the way to where? Rome. Right? Well, what mischievous superstition is he talking about? The resurrection, that he came back, that he proved that he was God by doing that. Right? Okay? He says, consequently, this is Tacitus talking, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So he says, well, of course Christianity would spread to Rome. Anything bad and weird shows up in Rome, is what he's basically saying, right? He says all these weird Christians, right, you would expect it to be in the sewer that is Rome, is what he's saying. Okay, but that is the story that we find in the New Testament, isn't it? Right? Persecution, and then what? Diaspora, spreading. Right? Okay? And, by the way, Dan Brown, the mischievous superstition that he's referring to is apparently a 1st century mischievous superstition, not an early 4th century idea that was decided at the Council of Nicaea according to the Da Vinci Code. Apparently Christ is being worshipped as what? God, early on. Okay? Okay, so if one were to argue, and I know this sounds silly, but do you realize there are people that went around sometimes arguing that Jesus didn't exist? By the way, no one does that anymore. I shouldn't say no one. There's got to be some lunatic somewhere that's doing it. But no one really does that anymore. The reason no one really does it anymore is you just can't. Okay? And the reason is Tacitus and guys like that. Okay? You could throw away the Bible and there's not a shadow of a doubt that Jesus existed. Okay? All right? It also confirms the existence of Jesus, his death, the fact that Christianity is based around a what? Mischievous superstition from the eyes of a Roman guy who doesn't particularly like them, right? And which is, I can't see how that's not the idea that Jesus is a resurrected God-man, okay? And that's just from one guy. We got a lot of guys, okay? And that this mischievous superstition originated where? In Judea. Now that's hugely important when we get to the later part of the course. Because again, if Christianity is based upon a resurrected Jesus, that means there's no body. There's no body for you to go, oh, come on, there he is. No, you got the wrong tomb. There he is. Joseph, is this your tomb? Yeah, crack it open. Oh, see, there he is. The body's gone. So if the body is lying somewhere rotting and he's not resurrected, you don't have this mischievous superstition. If the Romans have the body, they put it on a cart, they drive it down Main Street and say, Christians, what are you doing? He's right here. If the Jewish leaders have the body somewhere, they put it on a cart, drive it down Main Street and say, what are you talking about? He's right here. You don't have an outbreak of a mischievous superstition that spreads all the way to where? Rome, where people are willing to die in horrible ways for something they know to be true. Because he was on a beach with them cooking fish. Okay? Suetonius, who's a secretary to the Emperor Hadrian, he confirms that Claudius kicked the Christians out from Rome in AD 49. He confirms the Neronian persecution after the fire. And he again brings up this idea that the Christians have this bizarre addiction to this, what he calls mischievous superstition. Okay? So he finds them incredibly weird. By the way, the world finds us what? Incredibly weird. Because what we're saying is bizarre, unless, of course, what? It's true. In which case, it's miraculous, and he is God, and you better listen to him. Okay? He also refers to the idea that Christus, which he's calling Christ, right, instigates them. But again, we're not really sure what he meant by that. So he's blaming Jesus. Jesus sort of stirred them up somehow. Maybe by rising from the dead. I don't know. That's my guess. Okay. Okay. Josephus is huge. By the way, we have copies of his stuff up in our library. Did you know that? He writes, he's an interesting character because he's a Jewish historian who ends up working for the Romans. He's like a double agent. But he writes a couple big, he's really famous. He writes a couple big books. And he writes The Jewish Wars and the Antiquities. And you notice both of those dates are what century? First century. Okay, so anything he's referring to, right, has to come what? Before that. Sorry, Dan Brown. Okay? All right? And he makes a lot of helpful statements. But you got to be careful with him. Okay? First, he supports, and this is also separately helpful, by the way, he supports the canon of the Old Testament. In other words, he describes what is Scripture for the Jews, which does not include what we call the Apocrypha, okay? It includes what's in our Bible for the Old Testament. Those 39 books, right? That's what he talks about, all right? He also talks about Daniel as a 6th century BC writer. You say, well, what relevance does that have to this? Well, it actually does, and here's why. It was fashionable for a while to try to position Daniel as somebody who wrote, let's say, in the 2nd century BC. Do you know why people who were non-Christians want Daniel desperately to be 4 centuries later? Think about what Daniel says, right? What does Daniel say? Well, he makes all kinds of predictions. We would call them what? Prophecies, right? He makes all kinds of prophecies which have this annoying habit of coming what? True. So in fact, they said, this guy, this is the secular mindset, it can't have been written in the 6th century BC because he's so good. So therefore, we must have the date wrong Because otherwise, there's no way he could know about the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, right? He couldn't know that. So since that can't be right, because God can't be feeding him this information, that can't be the option, right? So therefore, he has to have written later. Well, a couple things. We have these things called the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have copies of Old Testament books back into the 2nd century. So we know, without this, by the way, that Daniel's written way earlier. The other thing Daniel prophesies, though, is that the Messiah, right, is going to be killed at a certain place before certain things happen. Remember that? So Daniel makes very specific predictions about the Messiah. So if he's doing that in the 6th century, that's kind of miraculous that he knows that. That's God inspired. So that's just a side note, but just to show you how helpful these guys could actually be. He also refers to a guy called James. Remember James? Poor James, right? Growing up, older brother's Jesus. Think about that. By the way, Jesus had how many brothers we're sure of that are named, right? There's 4 of them, aren't there? Right? And then it says sisters. So that he has a lot of half-siblings, right? Can you imagine the pressure, though, being Jesus' younger sibling, right? You always think Jesus is perfect. Yeah. Kind of do. You know? All right? So James is a non-believer. Remember him? Who then goes on to write the book of what? James, calling his older brother his what? Lord. And then dies for his faith. James goes from a non-believer to a guy willing to die a horrible death for the claim that his older brother's God. Now, what could make a little brother do that, except for the fact that his brother's God and came out of a tomb, right, and did something that nobody can do unless you are God, okay? So he also refers to the martyrdom of James, okay? He also confirms the existence of John the Baptist, who gets beheaded by Herod. That's a lot of specific stuff, by the way. He also confirms Jesus exists. Sorry, he does. That he's a virtuous man. That he had lots of disciples amongst the Jews and others. That he was crucified under Pilate. That his disciples reported his appearances 3 days after. Now, that's not Josephus saying he thinks that. He's telling you that he is recording the fact that the disciples said that. So if anyone were then going to say, well, resurrection is sort of a later interpolation, or resurrection, the idea of resurrection came along later. Josephus is writing in the what century? 1st century, and he's saying the guys that hung out with him were running around saying he came back. Okay, so here's a guy that is not a Christian who is telling you that resurrection was something claimed right away. Okay? And that people acknowledge him as the Messiah. Okay? He says, and by the way, pay attention to the highlighted parts because we have to be careful. He says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works. A teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. There's a lot of stuff in there. Now the highlighted parts are highlighted because most people do not think he wrote those. We think those are what are called interpolations by, let's say, overeager Christians trying to make it sound even better, which is a bad thing, right? That's cheating. We don't cheat here at First Baptist, all right? So we don't think that those are in there. However, if you look at the rest of the stuff that is in there, right? He's wise, according to Josephus, right? He's a doer of wonderful what? Works. Notice he didn't say people said he was. He said he was. By the way, nobody disputes. You don't find hostile sources or friendly sources disputing that Jesus did amazing stuff. Sometimes they might say he was able to do amazing stuff because he was involved in something weird, right? Remember the Jews in the New Testament say, well, you do these amazing things from your father, the devil, basically, right? Okay, but nobody disputes that he was able to do amazing stuff. Even people who don't play for our team, okay? And he says he's a teacher. He draws many people, Jews and Gentiles, to him. He does get crucified under Pilate at the suggestion of who? The principal men among us, meaning what? Jewish leaders. That fits with the Gospels, doesn't it? Caiaphas and his men, yeah? Okay. That those that loved him at the first didn't forsake him, for he what? Appeared alive again the third day. He says that as if it happened, by the way. Which makes me want to go to Mr. Josephus and go, and if that's true, what are you going to do with him? Okay? But he says that, as the prophets had foretold, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and then you've got this tribe of Christians that's still functional. There's a lot of goodies in there. From a guy who is not an identified Christian. Okay? Okay. Thallus writes really early. 52 AD is within, let's say, 18 to 20 years of the crucifixion, depending when it happened, okay? Let's say 20, okay? Thallus is preserved in other authors. So we don't have an actual copy of Thallus. By the way, it's hard to have copies of this stuff. You guys know that, right? Because stuff what? Deteriorates, right? But we still have an awful lot of stuff, okay? But Thallus is writing around 52 AD. It's preserved somebody else. He's preserved in the writings of Julius Africanus, who's writing later. Thallus apparently wrote about the darkness that associates the crucifixion. And if you remember in the Gospels, right, there's a 3-hour period, basically, of complete darkness. In addition to all the other crazy stuff going on when Jesus dies, right? You remember the crazy stuff that happened, right? Temple veil ripping, people coming out of tombs, just nutso land, right? Part of that was it got really dark, like for no apparent reason, right? And he identifies it, Thallus, as an eclipse of the sun. Africanus, who apparently had done some research, basically says, well, the conditions weren't right for it to be an eclipse. I don't really care if it was an eclipse or wasn't an eclipse, to be honest with you. I just think it's really cool that somebody in the very middle of the 1st century who's not a Christian is recording the darkness as an actual fact. Okay? Because that jives very specifically with the details that are found in the Gospels. Okay? Pliny the Younger, early 2nd century, he's a Roman guy. He's writing to the emperor about the early Christians. Okay? Because these Romans, they don't know what to do with the Christians. They find them incredibly weird. They don't get why they're willing to die. They're just, oh, come on, worship the emperor. What's wrong with you? Right? Why are you willing to... We're feeding you to the lions. What are you doing? Why not just renounce this Jesus guy, this mischievous superstition that you're addicted to, right? Okay? He confirms that Jesus was worshipped. Sorry, Dan Brown, right? Jesus was worshipped as God. Anybody that tells you that this is something that comes along later, I'm sorry, that's not an opinion, that's a factual error. It's not true. Okay? He also confirms they regularly ate together food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Right? They regularly came together and shared food. Okay? And Trajan, the emperor, replies with guidelines of what to do about them. Which is basically, well, if they renounce Christ, then pardon them. If not, well, oh well, right? If not, then they're going to die, basically. So the Christian problem for the Romans, right, is something that pops up in the documents, right? What do we do with these people? There's so many of them, first of all. By the way, that's another thing you get from this is you don't have a Christian problem if there's only a couple of people. There's a whole lot of them. And they're not talking about in Judea. They're talking about in the Roman Empire. This mischievous superstition spread like wildfire. But it started in Judea, where if it weren't true, the body's lying there. Okay. This guy definitely doesn't like... it's actually interesting. This guy actually is writing early on. He identifies Jesus as a wise king and says the Jews executed him. And then he claims something very interesting. He says that God avenged this by destroying what? Jerusalem, which happens in 70 A.D. If you remember Jesus weeping over Jerusalem? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how long I wanted to gather you to me, right? But you wouldn't listen, right? And Daniel, by the way, prophesies that the Messiah must be cut off before the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? And clearly Jesus is crucified in either about 33 AD or somewhere thereabouts, okay? And then within a generation and a half or so, the Romans level Jerusalem, killing all kinds of people. It's just awful what they do, okay? And Mara Bar Serapian's claim, right, is that there's a connection between these two things. So he's confirming, basically, for our purposes, two historical events. One, Jesus' execution, and two, the destruction of Jerusalem. But he's also got this sense that there's some sort of, what, connection there. Now, he might have the connection wrong, slightly wrong, or off, or whatever, but he's got the idea that these two events sort of are part of the same, what, storyline. I don't know where he got that from, but he has that idea, okay? This one's kind of weird, but when you think about it, actually is helpful. The Jewish Talmud calls Jesus Jeshu ben Pandera, which is basically making fun of this notion of the virgin birth, okay? And the Babylonian Talmud raises the idea that Jesus is an illegitimate son, that Mary is somehow, messing around, so on and so on. Well, you wouldn't have to have this narrative of Jesus being either, sometimes you hear, the product of a Roman soldier and Mary or whatever. You wouldn't have to have that counter-narrative if you didn't have a narrative to counter. In other words, you don't need ideas about where Jesus came from apart from the virgin birth unless there's a whole group of people running around asserting what? The virgin birth. So this, through sort of a backside entrance, right, helps us confirm that early Christians right away were asserting what? The miracle of the virgin birth. Otherwise, you don't need counterclaims, if that makes sense. Okay? So the fact that you have these malicious claims is good evidence that the early church insisted on the virgin birth. Okay? Lucian, who's a second century writer, he really doesn't like Christians. Okay? He's scornful of them. He calls him the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world, again confirming the crucifixion. Okay? He also confirms that the Christians had this weird notion that they were what? Brothers. Isn't that how we speak of each other? Right? Brothers in Christ, sisters in Christ, right? That's the way he has understood them to understand themselves. Okay? That they deny the Greek gods and that they worship Jesus. Now, he has a low opinion of Jesus. The wrap it up signal? Okay, yes, okay. All right. He has a low opinion of Jesus, okay? So somebody with a really low opinion of Jesus is still confirming early on that Jesus was in fact worshipped by Christians. Not that he was a nice man, right? Not that he was some sort of prophet, right? But that he was in fact what? God himself in a human body, a resurrected God-man, okay? So right away, we're off to a running start with, we haven't really even gone through all the extra biblical evidence that there is, okay? What we're going to do next time is we're going to start to dovetail just a little bit of archaeology into it too. Because not only do we have documentary extra biblical evidence, right, but we also have stuff we dig out of the ground that's helpful. And then from there we'll move on to what's inside the Gospels. And then from there we'll move on to the narrative itself. And then eventually to alternatives. But it's going to take us a while, as you can tell. All right? So when we get back next time, remind me, we were sort of mostly through hostile sources. Okay? All right. Rich, can you take us out, please?
Oh, Heavenly Father, we thank you for this presentation, that you would bless it to our hearts, help us to understand the truth. We pray, Father, for Dave as he leads, and as the word goes forth, that the truth may be entered into our hearts, that we may understand these things fully and appreciate your revelation to us of your word. Pray in